Welcome back to another episode of the podcast, Rameumptom Ruminations. My name is Scott, and I'm the host. Today's episode is called Antagonism or Criticism. Thanks for coming back to listen to another episode. Today I'm going to cover some comments that I received. This is at this point, it's months ago, back in the early summer, I think late July. A listener to the podcast did not like what I had to say in some of my episodes. And this listener was accusing me of being antagonistic. So today I want to read some of these comments. I want to think critically about what I said in those episodes and identify if I was actually being antagonistic or maybe if I was just being critical. I haven't done the shameless self-plug in a minute. If this podcast is something you enjoy, if this content is something that you find value in, please consider becoming a monthly recurring donor to the podcast. $1, $2, a recurring donation, whatever works for you. Or if that's not something you're financially able to do, you could like the episodes, comment on them, engage with whatever streaming platform you're using, and share it with friends and family where it's safe. I know in this space, we're not all able to share freely our thoughts and ideas around the church. So we'll jump into this. The episode in question was episode 102, The Cost of Belief. Jeez, that came out on July 12th. It's been a minute. I took a bit of a break between that month, between July and August until now. In that episode, I actually responded to a previous comment made by this same listener, Dave. He was upset with the way I was treating the LDS church. Now, in his response to me, he started talking about LGBTQ plus suicide rates, and he was bringing up things that had nothing to do with the discussion that we were having. In that episode specifically, we were talking about Pascal's wager and how, for me, it doesn't make sense. So in this discussion, in his comment, he's going over different statistics, citing NPR and other things. And then he says, the only time when antagonists seem to care is when they can potentially blame the LDS church. When it comes to members nationwide, again, he's talking about suicide rates. He says things like, do antagonists care about the high suicide rates in California? And then he's, lists some articles. I hope antagonists will bring real awareness to the nationwide problem. And as for the church, I think the LDS church does its best to balance the inherent risk and tries to lower it in the LGBTQ plus community. Again, I'm not going to dive into the subject that he's bringing up because that had nothing to do with what I was discussing in that episode. But throughout his whole comment, and again, I only read like 3 or 4 sentences, and it was a couple paragraphs long. Feel free to read it. And I was just paraphrasing. The point that I wanted to address, and I already did address in a brief comment back to him, he kept referring to me and others as antagonists. He kept using that word. Antagonists tried to do this against the church. Antagonists tried to do that against the church. Not once in the whole time that I've been doing this podcast have I ever thought of myself as an antagonist. I've never thought of myself as that stereotypical anti-Mormon. When, as a believer, we're always taught that the anti-Mormons are so angry and they're frustrated and they're mean and they want to tear down the church and destroy the work of God in the world. That has never, ever been the intention of my podcast. But throughout his whole comment, he kept referring to me, well, maybe indirectly to me, as an antagonist. And as I was reading his comment, as I'm, going through trying to figure out how I want to respond to this, I decided that nothing that he said really had anything to do with the episode. So I just stuck to responding to what he was calling me. He kept calling me an antagonist. My response was brief. Here's what I said. I try very hard not to be an antagonist of the church. There are people that I love dearly who are active members with temple recommends. I'm sorry if you felt I was being antagonistic. And then his response, he says back to me, Scott, when you give one-sided views and do not discuss views to the contrary, it is antagonistic. It looks to me you spend more of your time looking for problems than actual solutions to LDS controversial issues. I'm going to try and think about that. And maybe listeners out there help me come to a good conclusion on this. A listener who's listened to most of the episodes or all of the episodes I put out, is his assessment of me true? Am I antagonistic? I'm capable of critiquing myself. I'm capable of listening to a critique and making adjustments where needed. Since my intention is not to be antagonistic, I should listen to this and try to see if it actually does apply. So help me, listeners. Do you think I'm an antagonist against the LDS Church? I try pretty hard to give multiple ways to view a subject. In fact, the whole point of my Pascal's wager discussion wasn't to say that the church was false. In fact, a couple of times in those episodes, I said that it's a false binary to say it's either true or false. I said I was making the argument that a believer or a nuanced believer could come to the table and say, hey, I believe this, this, and that, but this aspect of it doesn't seem to line up with reality or history. In my mind, in those episodes, I was trying to offer a solution to some of the controversial issues. We could list, the problem of polygamy. A solution to the problem of polygamy would be the LDS Church denouncing it. But until that happens, maybe the solution for a believer would be to them personally denouncing it. They could still believe in the church, but they could remove that doctrine, that belief from their own personal practice. When I say things like that, to me, that's me offering a solution to these controversial issues. It may not be the solution that this listener wants, but that's offering a solution. And that's, in my mind, being generous. I have been known to be wrong on many, many occasions. So, listeners, am I wrong about that? Am I not being generous? I feel like that's my whole shtick. I try to offer a solution to believers when I can. Sometimes I forget because that's not where I'm coming from. I'm not a believer, but I do try pretty hard to add that stuff into what I'm saying. I'm rambling. Let me get into what I wanted to discuss. So I want to draw a distinction between what I feel like I'm doing with this podcast and what this listener is accusing me of doing. I think I'm being critical. My intention is to critique. I'm trying to look at the LDS Church, its doctrines, its practices, policies, the talks, whatever the subjects that's coming out. My intention is to analyze it, break it down into its parts, think about it critically, and come to a conclusion based on the connections that I made while reading or listening to the articles or whatever it is that I'm discussing. I'm trying to engage in critical analysis by analyzing what's being said, the context where it comes from, implications of the statements, being analyzed. I'm trying to use my critical thinking skills to break down these subjects. Always try to be as fair as possible in these assessments. There's a distinction between critical analysis and antagonism. So I'm going to relate this to something that I do pretty regularly. I go to the movies a lot with a dear friend of mine who, again, if that listener, Dave, is out there, I have dear friends who are members of the church who know that I do this podcast and have listened to episodes. Anyway, this friend of mine, we go to the movies regularly. And after the movie's over, every single time, we walk back to our cars together and sometimes we tear the movie to shreds. We critique every aspect of it, the cinematography, the props, the color usage, the color palettes of the different characters and the settings that they've placed them in. We critique the dialogue, the acting. We break down the movie into its most basic parts. And to anyone listening, it might sound like we didn't enjoy the whole process of going to the movie together, that we're maybe being critical or overanalyzing. Maybe that's probably true. We're probably overanalyzing. Regardless, what we do is we break it down and we discuss the parts to try and understand exactly what is being said, what was the intention of the director, of the actors with their portrayal. Why make this or that choice in the movie? My friend and I, we spend hours talking about the movies that we watched, and it's a very enjoyable experience. But after all of our criticism and our analysis of what we watched, it doesn't mean that we didn't enjoy it or that we didn't have parts of the movie that we absolutely loved. In fact, oftentimes the movies that we go see are really good movies. We just like to break them down and think critically about the media that we're taking part in. I even recently had a listener, Adam. We were discussing the movie Oppenheimer, and I think if I understood Adam correctly, we both enjoyed the movie, but there were many aspects of it that both of us thought didn't land the right way, or things that we thought maybe should have been more prominently front and center and discussed throughout the movie. But again, just because we have a critique or a criticism doesn't mean that we don't find good things in it as well. In my mind, what I'm doing with the LDS Church is criticism. It is not antagonism. Antagonism, in my mind, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding these words, but antagonism is active hostility. It is actively trying to tear down the institution. And maybe a case could be made that starting a podcast and discussing the problems within the LDS Church could be antagonistic. But I've tried pretty hard to keep an open mind and make this approachable for believers and non-believers alike. So I don't think the intention of my podcast is antagonism. And hopefully motive counts for something. Let me put it on the record. I'm not expressly opposed to the LDS Church. I don't think it should be torn down and disappear forever. Now, there are many aspects of the church that I disagree with, that I think are harmful, and that I think need to change, but not everything falls into that category. There are aspects of the faith that are uplifting, and for certain demographics, it is a great institution to raise a family. Now, these are not all-encompassing statements, because there are other demographics of people where it's unhealthy and is not a great place to raise a family. And the aspects of the church that make it unsafe for people are the aspects that I want to change. And if a listener hears me say that and thinks of me as an antagonist, then for them, maybe I am an antagonist. But for me, and I think any other critically thinking person, I think I'm taking a pretty middle ground stance on this. I don't know, help me out, listeners. Am I totally off on this one? I want to relate a story. The week is like a week or two after I received this comment and had this brief interaction. I didn't go back and forth. He responded to me again, and I just kind of left it at that because I didn't think there was a reason to keep going back and forth. I went to a family reunion with my spouse and her extended family. I met up with one of my wife's cousin's husbands. We've known them over the years. We don't see him super often, but we sat down, we were chatting over lunch, and he let me know that he was aware of my podcast. We sat down, we had an excellent conversation. He is a believer, and he was aware of my podcast, and we had a really open dialogue about some of the criticisms and some of the episodes that he had listened to. A key distinction for me, and maybe this is a trust thing where this listener, Dave, doesn't know me. Maybe he doesn't know what my intentions are or the type of person I am. And I think there might be an element of trust when someone is analyzing whether or not a person is being antagonistic or critical. But criticism doesn't just have to be negative. You can think critically and come to a positive view of things. And there are aspects of the LDS Church where that is the case. Thinking critically about some of the social safety nets that they put in place, helping others, specifically within like the Relief Society program, and helping with dinners when someone has an issue. There are good elements within the LDS Church. Anyway, I'm babbling again. I'm sitting down and we're having an open conversation about the fact that I am running a podcast talking critically about the LDS Church. And it didn't negatively affect our relationship. Again, I mentioned my friend who I go to the movies with regularly. There's two guys that I go with. One that I go with like every other week, and one who comes a couple times a year with us. Both of them active members of the church, fully believing. They both know that this is something that I do. And I don't think either of them have actually listened, which is totally fine. But there are many things that I say in my podcast episodes that these friends would disagree with, that they might think go against their beliefs. And maybe some of the things I say could offend them. They don't look at me as an antagonist or as an anti-mormon, because that's not what I am. I'm not out there telling them that they can't believe, that they can't hold their faith in whatever they want. I'm not out there burning down church buildings. I'm simply asking critical questions of key doctrines of the church. What I want to flip this around to this listener, Dave. Whether he listens or not, that's fine. But we'll flip this idea on its head and direct the question back to the one accusing me of being anti-Mormon or an antagonist to the church. Why does criticism of the LDS Church feel like antagonism? Is it possible to criticize an institution without antagonizing it? What would criticism of the LDS Church look like in a healthy way for a believer? I could go down the rabbit hole and talk about a persecution complex within Christian denominations and how they like to victimize themselves sometimes, but I'm not going to go down that route. I hope to encourage within this believer, whether Dave listens or not, or it's another believer down the road listening to this, why is the assumption that criticism of the LDS Church is always antagonism or anti-Mormon? I try my hardest to be fair in my critique of the LDS Church. So if I'm off on that, if a listener thinks that maybe I need to change, let me know. This is your moment. I'm asking for critique. If you're listening out there, Dave, he was the guy that made the original comments. I have no ill will towards you. And in fact, I wish you the best. We disagree on some things, but I hope that you understand that my intention is not antagonism with this. It's criticism. And I think criticism is healthy. If we can look at ourselves, our own lives, the institutions that we're a part of, politically, religiously, whatnot, if we can look at them critically, think about them to find both the good and the bad, we can work towards making this world a better place. And that's for me, the dream is to try and put out more positive vibes than negative ones into the world, help more people than I harm, to be a net good for this world. So if I'm failing miserably in this, please let me know, because I need to make some changes then. Thanks so much for listening in today. I know this discussion wasn't rooted in some of the philosophy or literature that I do sometimes. It was just kind of my thoughts. But I wanted to make it kind of a more casual conversation. I hope that the listener's big takeaway from this is that my intention is not antagonism. I hope to help believers and non-believers, doubting, newly doubting, long doubting, wherever you find yourself on the belief spectrum. I hope that you find a place where you can engage with the LDS Church critically in a safe and healthy environment. That's what I'm trying to create here. If a listener is not okay with any sort of critical analysis of the LDS Church, maybe this podcast isn't for you. And that's okay, Dave. You don't have to listen. And I would ask that you don't leave a negative review, though, because I really only would like 5-star reviews. I'm just kidding. Rate it how you feel, Dave. If you really hate me, that's okay, too. I can live with myself if you hate me. So, wherever you find yourself out there, enjoying a light snack in the afternoon, I hope that you have an excellent day.